Side 4. All the snow had vanished. The dome was full of green plants, arching high above the ground and spreading long, lush tendrils over trellised screens. The floor, which had been covered by nearly a metre of snow, was paved and patched with grass, and there were sun lounges everywhere and little tables with umbrellas.
"It's like being abroad," breathed Harvey. "It's like the beach."
"Fancy a swim, do you?" drawled Ian. He pointed down the slide. It wasn't a ski slide anymore. Now it swooped towards a shimmering blue swimming pool with water plants round the edges and a little island in the middle.
"What a wonderful water chute,"
whispered Mandy. Ian frowned.
"The problem with water chutes is—"
He didn't have time to say what the problem was. Suddenly, there was a hiss from the far side of the shelter. A jet of water shot out of the wall and hit all 4 of them. They went flying forwards, knocked off their feet. Harvey skidded in the water, fell over and slipped down the ramp with a squeal. Lloyd slid after him, and behind them, tumbling awkwardly from side to side of the chute, came Ian and Mandy, heading straight for the water. Lloyd hit it with a huge splash, almost on top of Harvey. For a few seconds his ski suit buoyed him up, and he grabbed at Harvey's shoulder as Ian and Mandy splashed down behind them. "Got to swim to the side," he panted, "before our clothes get heavy." But Harvey was treading water and staring across the dome. "Look!" Was it the men in brown overalls? Lloyd flipped round and gasped again. The men were watching them all right, but they couldn't get near the pool because of the stream of people in between. Hundreds of men, women and children in swimming costumes and shorts were marching out of the dark space at the end where the skiers had disappeared. They moved quickly, but their faces were completely blank, and they weren't laughing or talking to each other. They simply walked into the dome, found a space to stand, and stopped. When the last person had walked in, the grating, creaking noise started up again. The end wall of the dome began to turn, just as it had before, until its other side was facing inwards. Where the hot dog stall had been, there was a bar selling drinks and ice cream, and draped above it was a banner which said, "Snow tomorrow, sun today." As soon as the wall was in place, the shrill whistle sounded, and immediately all the people woke up. They began laughing and chatting, as though they had been in the dome for a long time. Some of them plunged into the pool, but a lot more headed for the circular staircase and began climbing up towards the water chute. The men in brown overalls moved too. As soon as the whistle blew, they began to pick their way through the crowd, not running, but heading straight for the swimming pool.
"Hurry!"
hissed Mandy.
"We've got to get out of here."
She swam across the pool to the side furthest away from the men and began to haul herself out. A little boy pointed at her and giggled.
"Look, Mummy, they got it wrong. They think it's skiing today."
He went off into peals of laughter, saying the words over and over again.
"They think it's skiing! They think it's skiing!"
Lloyd reached the side and pulled himself out of the water. "It was skiing an hour ago," he said loudly. The little boy's mother smiled.
"It's muddling sometimes, isn't it? But it's been sun all day today. I've been sunbathing since breakfast."
She waved her hand towards a sun lounger at the side of the pool. "You haven't," Lloyd said. "You've only just come." The woman's smile disappeared.
"Don't be silly, dear. I know what I've been doing."
"But—" Ian stuck his head between them. "It's no use, Lloyd. She won't believe you. You haven't got time to argue. Look." Lloyd glanced round. Half a dozen men in brown overalls were closing in on them. They were spread out in a half circle, blocking the main door and both the fire exits. There was only one way to run, towards the end wall where the big banner hung over the bar. Lloyd couldn't see a door there, but there had to be a way through. That was where the skiers had gone. "Come on!" he hissed at the others. "Follow me!" One or two people turned to stare as they pushed through the crowd, and a couple of children giggled, but most people were too busy to take any notice. They were buying HP's ice cream soda, stick your snout in one of these, or pumping up their stylos, ready to float in the pool. They weren't interested in 4 children in dripping wet ski suits, or in the men who were following them. The men in brown overalls slipped through the crowd without drawing attention to themselves, closing in, steadily and relentlessly. Harvey looked despairingly at the end wall.
"There isn't a door, El! What are we going to do?"
"Vermilion vermicelli! How should I know?" Lloyd gazed at the wall. It was covered with thick creepers, and it didn't look as though it had ever moved at all.
"We'll have to dodge back," Mandy said faintly. "Maybe if we split up."
But she didn't bother to finish. They could all see that was no good. There was no way of getting past the men. They were being slowly herded towards the wall, and when they reached it, they would be caught. "Get ready to make a lot of noise," murmured Ian. "If we're dragged off yelling, people might wonder what's happening. Ready?" But Lloyd was still staring at the wall. "Hang on," he hissed. "Look at that!" Hidden among the creepers was a long iron ladder. It led right up to the top of the dome, to a trap-door in the roof. Lloyd grabbed the sides with both hands and began to haul himself up. Harvey scrambled on behind, so close that his hands brushed Lloyd's ankles, and Ian followed. But Mandy darted away from the ladder towards the nearest sun lounger. "No!" Lloyd called. "They'll catch you!" Mandy grinned over her shoulder. Then she bent to pick something up from the sun lounger, pushing it into her trouser pocket. When she leapt for the ladder, the men were only 10 meters behind.
"Quick!" she panted. "Get as high as you can, Lloyd. I'm going to stop them following us."
By the time the men reached the bottom of the ladder, Mandy was high above their heads. She stopped and pulled a blue plastic bottle out of her pocket. As she unscrewed the cap, Lloyd peered down at the words on the bottle. "Hunky's Special Suntan Oil, the way to brown your bacon." Clinging on with one hand, Mandy bent down and tipped the suntan oil down the ladder just as the first man began to climb. As it dripped greasily from rung to rung, Mandy began to climb again, watching over her shoulder. One man was on the ladder. He managed another 2 or 3 rungs, but then his hands began to slip on the oil. "You little—" he yelled. He went slithering backwards, trailing oil all the way down to the bottom and landing on top of the other men. "Climb!" yelled Lloyd. "They can't follow us!" Harvey gave a little squeak.
"It's very high!"
"Don't look! Just keep climbing!" Harvey scrambled higher, and Lloyd kept ahead of him, gazing up at the trap-door in the roof. He thought it would be locked, but when he reached the top of the ladder and pushed it, it flicked open easily. Fresh, cool air flooded down. Lloyd pulled himself through onto the roof and lay there panting, looking down through the arching glass. Men in brown overalls were racing towards the dome from every side, fanning out to surround it. As Harvey came through the trapdoor, he saw them too, and his bottom lip trembled.
"We'll never be able to get down. They're all over the grass."
But Lloyd was looking the other way, towards the ugly building attached to the back of the dome. "We could get down onto that roof. Look!" The building was a dull grey box, over 100 meters long. It looked more like a warehouse or a factory than part of a holiday centre. There were no words painted on it, no pictures of Hunky Parker, not a single speck of colour to brighten it up, except for the squares of blue where the sky was reflected in the skylights. Lloyd stared at those skylights, and suddenly he knew what they had to do. "We can't get down, but we can try getting in. I bet there are lots of hiding places in that building." Ian nodded as he climbed through the trap-door. "If we keep low, the men won't be able to see where we go." Dropping onto his front, Lloyd wriggled towards the flat roof. By the time Mandy scrambled out of the dome, he was already 10 meters away, examining the first skylight. "This one's locked, but there's some kind of workshop down there. Lots of machines and things. No one's working, but whoops!" He jerked his head back quickly as a grey lady walked underneath.
"Be careful,"
hissed Mandy. Ian waved his hand at the next skylight. "How about that? It looks half open." Lloyd wriggled a bit further and peered in. "It looks like a television studio. There are cameras and scenery screens, and big lights on stands, and a control room."
"Never mind what it's for," muttered Ian. "Is there anyone in there?"
Lloyd checked carefully. "No one at all, and there are 2 doors at the other end, both open."
"Let's get down there, then."
"Here I go." Lloyd let himself down as far as he could and dropped the rest of the way. Then he glanced round. He was at one end of a large studio, with nothing around him except bare polished floor. The cameras and scenery screens were halfway down, and at the far end was a control room with glass sides built along the wall between the 2 doors. The only strange thing was a groove in the floor. It ran from one side of the studio to the other, in between where he was standing and everything else. For a second Lloyd stared down at it. Then 2 feet kicked him in the back.
"Catch me, Al!"
Harvey slithered into his arms, and Ian and Mandy followed. "Right," hissed Lloyd as Mandy hit the floor. "Let's get going." He took 1 step towards the doors. Immediately, there was a loud rattle from in front of him. Before he could move any further, a thick metal grill rose out of the groove in the floor. At the same moment, with a harsh, grating noise, a metal plate slid across the skylight opening, blocking it off completely. They were caged in. Chapter 10. Ape. Dinah and Ingrid were trapped. They stared into the empty workshop, listening to the click, click, click of the grey lady's heels as she walked up and down between the machines, watching. Ingrid scowled.
"Why doesn't she go away?"
"I think she's waiting for something," Dinah said slowly. "She keeps looking up at the clock." Click, click. Suddenly the grey lady stopped. She glanced at the clock again, then walked across to the door at the end of the workshop and flung it open. In marched another long line of people. They were just like the people who had left, blank-faced and mechanical. But they weren't dressed for the beach. They were wearing thick padded suits in bright colours, and most of them had woolly hats on their heads.
"They look like skiers,"
muttered Ingrid. Dinah nodded. "They must be sweltering." If they were, they didn't show it. They moved where the grey lady pointed, going to the machines that the beach people had just left. When they reached their places, they stood motionless and silent, until the whistle sounded again. Then, immediately, every machine in the workshop whirred into action, and the skiers bent forward to begin their tasks, working like lightning. Ingrid shuddered.
"They make the Hunky Parker things?"
"Suppose so." Dinah leaned forward, looking for Hunky Parker's face, but she couldn't make it out. There was something on the things churned out of the machine, some kind of symbol, but it didn't seem quite right. Ingrid snorted.
"I'm not hanging round to watch, even if you are."
Before Dinah could grab her, she leapt out of the corner and went racing down the corridor, in full view of the workshop. "Ing!" It was sheer good luck that the grey lady didn't see anything. She had just stepped behind a big printing press that hid her completely. Before she emerged, Ingrid had reached the first door on the right. She pressed the handle, but it was locked. Whipping out the bunch of keys, she began to try them one by one. "Come back!" Dinah was sure the grey lady would see. Any minute now she would be coming out from behind the printing press. But just in time, Ingrid found the right key. Unlocking the door, she disappeared through it with a triumphant grin, leaving Dinah trapped in the corner as the grey lady turned to stare through the window. She seemed to stare forever. But at last she began to march round the workshop again, inspecting everything with her sharp, bright eyes. Dinah held her breath, waiting. Then, the moment the grey lady reached the printing press again, she dashed. She scuttled 10 meters down the corridor and darted in at the door where Ingrid had disappeared.
Ing!
But the room was empty. There were charts and graphs all over the walls, and a big table in the middle with 9 or 10 chairs round it, but Ingrid wasn't there. There was nothing else in the room except a tall cupboard on the right-hand side.
Where are you?
Dinah called softly. There was a deep grunt from inside the cupboard.
Stop fooling about!
There was another grunt. The cupboard creaked. Then it flew open and a massive figure lurched out, 6 feet tall, with a huge, hairy head and enormous, clutching hands that reached out to grab Dinah. A giant ape!
What?
For a second, Dinah was rigid with terror. Then the ape lurched towards her, and she dodged sideways just in time. The ape turned to follow, and one of its legs wobbled and gave way.
Whoops!
Said a familiar voice.
Ing!
Dinah grabbed furiously at the fur, and there was a giggle from behind the ferocious mask.
Isn't it brilliant? There are things to stand on inside the feet, a bit like being on stilts. You feel gigantic. What do you think it's for?
I don't know. Dinah studied the coarse, thick hair of the ape suit. Where did you find it?
It was locked in the cupboard.
Ingrid held up the keys, letting them swing from the metal label that said Dispatch Coordinator.
I undid the door and... Ah!
She staggered backwards dramatically and landed with her head against the wall. Right beside a chart that looked very familiar to Dinah. January, February, March, April the 1st to the 13th, Hunky Parker. April the 13th, HP9. April the 14th to the 30th, May, June, Ape, controlled riots. July, total takeover.
Ape!
Dinah took a deep breath and pointed at the chart.
Look, Ing! That's who you're dressed up as.
Ingrid frowned.
What does it mean?
I think there's going to be a swap, Dinah said slowly. After April the 13th, Ape will be the new craze, like Hunky Parker is now.
You mean we're going to be wearing hairy tracksuits and trainers with 5 fingers where the toes ought to be?
Something like that, said Dinah. Maybe... Click, click, click.
What's that?
Muttered Ingrid. Click, click, click. There were footsteps outside. Someone was coming down the corridor towards them.
Quick!
Seizing Ingrid's shoulder, Dinah dragged her into the cupboard and pulled the door shut.
Keep still, she hissed. Don't make a sound.
Ingrid opened her mouth to argue, and then shut it again. The feet had stopped outside their door. It opened, and someone marched in, walking briskly up to the table and pulling out a chair to sit on. Dinah held her breath. A second later there were more footsteps. Click, click, click. And then more, and more, until 7 people had walked in altogether. Dinah couldn't bear it. She had to see what was going on. Very, very carefully, she opened the door a crack. 7 grey ladies were sitting round the table with briefcases by their sides and neat clipboards in front of them. All of them were dressed in identical grey overalls, with their hair pulled back into tight little buns, and all of them were rigidly upright, staring towards the door, as though they were waiting for someone else to appear. It was a few seconds before the last person came down the corridor, and this time the footsteps were quite different, quieter and heavier. When they reached the door, the grey ladies glanced at each other and got up, standing stiffly to attention. Dinah clenched her fists nervously. The door opened. Altogether, the grey ladies chorused,
Good morning, Hunky.
There was no answering greeting. A tall figure marched up to the far end of the table and pulled out a chair. Then it turned, and Dinah found herself gazing at the face from the video. Hunky Parker himself, with his stiff, unchanging mask and his terrible eyes. She clenched her fists harder until the fingernails dug into her skin. Then the figure spoke. "Let us begin without wasting any more time." For a second, Dinah couldn't hear anything else. Her head spun and the blood pounded in her ears. The last time she had heard that voice, it had been plotting to take over the Prime Minister's brain, and she had nearly burnt to death trying to stop the plot. Her heart began to thud, but she forced herself to go on looking. The heavy mask covered the figure's head completely. It was perfectly modelled, with every disgusting detail bright and clear. The nostrils were slimy, the ears were spattered with mud, and there was a trail of saliva at the corner of the mouth. But the voice coming out of the mouth was unmistakable. It belonged to the headmaster, who couldn't bear mess and disorder. "So far, my plans have gone smoothly," snapped the voice. "All the shops in the country are full of Hunky Parker goods, and when people cannot get them, they riot, exactly as I intended." Dinah remembered the crowd on the hill and shuddered. "Those riots will spread all over the country," the voice went on, "when HP9 goes out. People will want Ape instead of Hunky Parker, but there will be nothing for them to buy, so they will smash and loot and run wild." Dinah held her breath, and Ingrid stood stock still. They both knew they mustn't get caught. They had to find out what was going on. "I shall allow the riots to continue for approximately 10 weeks, said the headmaster. "I expect several deaths in that time, and considerable destruction of property."
Why?
Thought Dinah. She could hardly believe her ears. Why should the headmaster want that? He obviously wasn't going to explain. Instead, he looked briskly up and down the table. "Is everything prepared as I instructed?" One of the grey ladies rustled her papers efficiently. "Preparations are on target. Everything will be ready when HP9 goes out on the 13th of April. "That date has had to be changed," snapped the headmaster. "Some meddling person has discovered the subliminal frames on a Hunky Parker video." The grey ladies gasped, and inside the cupboard Dinah and Ingrid looked at each other. But the green eyes behind the mask did not waver. "Luckily," said the headmaster, "we were warned in time. We have retrieved that video, and all the unsold copies, but we must not take chances, so HP9 will not go out on the 13th of April. It will go out today." There was a rustle and another gasp. The headmaster ignored them. "Because of this change of plan, the workshops will need to double their production. Please make sure that all the workers operate twice as fast as before. They must—" A loud bleep interrupted him. There was a shocked mutter from the grey ladies, and Dinah saw the headmaster's eyes flicker as he pulled a telephone out of his pocket. "Who is it?" he snapped. A voice came crackling from the phone, loud enough for everyone to hear. "There has been a failure of Procedure 73. Snoopers have escaped into the sty."
Procedure 73 never fails,
said one of the grey ladies sharply.
not if it is properly carried out,
said another. The headmaster silenced them with a look and spoke into the phone. "Where are the snoopers now?" For one terrible moment, Dinah thought the voice would say, "In the cupboard next to you." But it didn't. The answer crackled back briskly. "We have applied Procedure 17, and the snoopers are trapped at the collection point." The headmaster nodded. "Excellent. I shall go and deal with them." He put the phone away and looked round the table at the grey ladies. "Go back and double the speed of the workshops ready for HB9, and send a detachment of manual operatives to the collection point, equipped with ropes." One of the grey ladies nodded.
I will send them at once.
The headmaster stood up and led the way to the door. When he reached it, he turned and fixed all the grey ladies with his chilly green stare. "Those are Hunky's orders."
"Hunky's orders will be obeyed,"
the grey ladies chanted together. They stepped into the corridor and went clicking off to the left as the headmaster turned right. The moment they were gone, Ingrid burst out of the cupboard, waving her hairy arms furiously.
"Come on, we've got to follow. It must be Lloyd and the others they've got trapped."
Dinah swallowed. "But we mustn't get caught. We might be the only people who know about this HP9 thing. Whatever it is, we've got to find a way of stopping the headmaster." Ingrid looked impatient.
"We can deal with that when we've saved the others."
She wrenched open the door and then dived back into the room. There were a dozen men in brown overalls coming down the corridor towards them. But it was too late to escape. The men had seen her, and they headed straight for the door, tugging it open while her hand was still on the handle. One of them marched in and grabbed her shoulder. "What's the fancy dress for?" Another seized Dinah. "What are you up to?" They were enormous. They crowded into the doorway, completely blocking it, so that they hid the workshop on the other side of the corridor. Ingrid's big ape mouth opened, but no words came out. Only a little strangled squeak. Dinah didn't even try to speak. "Come on!" The man who was holding Ingrid shook her shoulder fiercely. "Are you snooping?"
I...
Ingrid's eyes stared desperately from behind the eye holes of the mask, and Dinah struggled to think. It was no use trying to run away. Even if they could get free, the men would catch them before they had gone 10 meters, and the grey lady in the workshop would see them. But what could they do? The men were glancing at each other. "Procedure 92, said one. 94, said another. "We have to fetch the security coordinator." "No!" Dinah felt frantic. That mustn't happen. If only she could think. She glanced round wildly and saw what the men were carrying. Ropes. They were equipped with ropes. They were the manual operatives the headmaster had asked for. Her brain went into hyperdrive. Pulling herself up straight, she glared at the men. "We are going to come with you," she said firmly. "You are to let us come, but you must ignore us. You must not even look at us. Those—" She could hardly believe it would work. She had to try. "Those are Hunky's orders." It was like magic. Immediately the men who were holding on to them let go. All the men took a step backwards, and their eyes glazed over. "Hunky's orders will be obeyed," they chanted together. Then they turned to the right, ready to march down the corridor. Dinah grabbed Ingrid's arm. "Come on!"
"But—"
Ingrid hadn't understood.
"Don't you see?"
Dinah said impatiently.
"They're going to where the others are. We can go with them, and they'll hide us." "Oh, yes!"
Ingrid almost leapt through the door, tugging Dinah after her. As the men started to march, the two of them were close beside, completely hidden from the workshop by the huge brown-overalled bodies. Down one corridor they went, round a corner and along another corridor with dull grey walls on both sides. Dinah and Ingrid slipped to the back of the group, keeping a wary eye on where they were going. They swung round into another corridor, and there was a closed door ahead of them. Above it was a red light and the words, "Studio, do not enter." And standing in front of the door was the headmaster. Dinah's heart gave one enormous thud. She grabbed Ingrid and pulled her back round the corner. The two of them stood very, very still, listening hard. They heard the door open. Then the headmaster's voice spoke briskly, giving orders. "Go straight into the studio, line up in front of the cage and wait for me." The men moved in at a steady tramp. Holding her breath, Dinah peered round the corner. She couldn't see much of the room, but just inside the door was a small glass booth packed with monitor screens and computer consoles. It looked like a control room. That might be a good place to hide, to watch what was going on in the studio. But did they dare try and get there? She had just decided it was too risky when the headmaster followed the men into the studio and closed the door. Immediately, Ingrid darted round the corner, padding on her big soft feet. "Come on,
We might be able to get into that little room thing.
But he'll see us, protested Dinah.
We've got to try. Come on.
Before Dinah could say any more, Ingrid was at the door, pressing the handle down slowly and softly. She peered into the room and then glanced over her shoulder with a grin. Dropping onto her stomach, she began to wriggle towards the control room. There was nothing Dinah could do except follow. Chapter 11. Parcelled Up. Lloyd stood holding the bars of the cage and stared out into the studio. For a second he had hoped there was a chance of escaping, but now he knew that it was no use. A line of men in brown overalls was marching into the room. They were caught. The men lined up in front of the cage without speaking, staring straight ahead. Harvey blinked at them.
Do you think we should try and explain?
He faltered. They don't look as though they've come for a chat, muttered Ian.
But they are people, Mandy said bravely. Maybe...
Nervously she smiled at them through the bars. Then her smile vanished as someone else walked through the door. The line of brown-overalled men parted, and between them walked a tall, thin figure in a mask. Hunky Parker. Harvey gave a little cry and stepped closer to Lloyd, and Mandy clenched her fists. They had all gone white and very still. It was impossible to see what the person in the mask was thinking. But when he spoke, his voice was like steel. So, you are interfering again. Where are the rest of you?
They got left behind,
Harvey said. His voice was trembling, but he sounded defiant.
But they won't let you get away with this. They'll come after us.
The headmaster's eyes snapped. They will be too late. In a few hours you will have vanished forever, unless you agree to cooperate.
Cooperate with you?
Lloyd snorted scornfully.
We won't be turned into holiday robots.
Mandy slipped her arm round Harvey's shoulders and stared at the headmaster.
Why do you need to hypnotize those people anyway? They could have fun on their own without that.
Fun?
There was a scornful snort from behind the Hunky Parker mask.
You think the dome was built for fun, so that people could waste their time and energy?
It looked like pretty good fun to me, drawled Ian. Skiing down the snow slide. There's nothing useful about that.
On the contrary,
the headmaster said scornfully.
The sty was specially designed to use all the energy people waste on slides. Everyone who goes down my slides is helping to drive the generator that powers this building.
You mean they're producing electricity when they slide?
Lloyd stared. What for?
I can see that you have no idea what is going on here, the headmaster said smoothly,
and I have no intention of telling you. Twice already you have stood in my way. This time I shall succeed. Today I am launching the plan that will put me in control of the country. But first, I shall get rid of you four.
He turned to the men in brown overalls.
What do you see?
They replied together, their eyes glazing over as they chanted the words,
We see what Hunky tells us. That is correct.
The headmaster pointed towards the cage.
What you see in this cage are 4 rolls of carpet ready for dispatch abroad. What do you see? 4 rolls of carpet,
said the men obediently.
Rubbish! Yelled Lloyd. Do I look like a roll of carpet? Watch!
He began to jump about, waving his arms and pulling faces at the men.
Come on, you 3, show them!
Harvey, Ian and Mandy began to jump too, twisting their bodies around and yelling. But it was no use. The men didn't even blink. And the headmaster went on giving orders.
You are to take these carpets and bind them tightly with cords from top to bottom. A small smile crossed his face. "So that they travel safely." Lloyd glared through the bars.
"It's no good. You won't get rid of us like that. If you send us away, we'll just come back."
"You will?" The headmaster sounded amused. "I don't think so." He turned to the men in brown overalls. "Lower the bars and tie up the carpets." One of the men pulled down a lever in the wall, and slowly, with a harsh, grinding noise, the heavy bars began to sink back into the groove in the floor. There was no chance of escaping. The moment the bars were low enough, Lloyd was seized by 3 of the men in brown overalls. The others grabbed Harvey, Ian, and Mandy and began to bind them tightly. Their feet were tied together first. Then the men spun them round and round, wrapping them in cord from head to foot. For as long as he could, Lloyd shouted, trying to get the men to listen to him.
"Exploding emerald eggshells! Can't you see he's got you hypnotized? We're not carpets, we're children!"
It was no use. The men's expressions did not change at all. Harvey's face grew pinker and pinker as he spun round.
"Where are we going, Elle? What's going to happen to us?" "Don't be afraid."
Lloyd sounded as confident as he could.
"Wherever we're going, we can still stick together. We're SPLAT, and—"
The cord had reached his mouth. It slid in, gagging him, and he almost choked. But he could still see, and he shuddered at the headmaster's smile. The last knot was tied, and the men in brown overalls turned towards the headmaster.
"The carpets are ready, sir. What shall we do with them?"
"Take them to dispatch," said the headmaster. "They must be parcelled up straight away, but they are not urgent. Tell the dispatch coordinator they can be sent by sea."
"Where are they to go?"
For a moment, the headmaster paused. Then he took out a pad of paper and began to write addresses in neat black script. "This one," he pointed at Harvey, "is to go to Burkina Faso. The tall one next to it," that was Ian, "is for Sarawak." Different places. Lloyd hadn't thought of that. His heart sank as he struggled to remember the names of the places. The headmaster moved along the line and prodded the bundle that was Mandy. "This one is for Suriname." Where on earth was Suriname? Lloyd wished he had learned more geography. He could see enough of Mandy's face to guess that she knew where it was, and it wasn't anywhere near Wales. "And this one?" The headmaster stopped for a moment when he got to Lloyd. He looked him up and down, frowning. "This one had better go to Pitcairn Island." Pitcairn Island? Lloyd had never heard of it. It sounded a long way away. He began to grunt and struggle, but the headmaster ignored the noise. Stepping back, he waved a hand at the bundles. "Obey your orders." Immediately, the men hoisted the 4 bundles onto their shoulders. Lloyd found himself travelling head first on his side, gazing at the wall. Beside him was Mandy, but he couldn't talk to her, and he couldn't turn and look at Harvey, who was grunting uncomfortably somewhere behind. As they were carried off along the corridor, Lloyd struggled to wriggle his head round just an inch or two to get a glimpse of Harvey, but it was impossible. He was trussed too tight to move. And then they went round a corner, and he saw something that drove everything else out of his head. The corridor had a glass wall, and behind it was what looked like a factory running at top speed. At double top speed. The machines were rattling and thudding, and the workers' hands were flying backwards and forwards, almost too fast to see. That was peculiar enough. But there was something even odder. Why were all the workers wearing skiing clothes? For a second, Lloyd was utterly bewildered. Then he saw a face he recognized. It was one of the children who'd been making a snowman in the dome. So this was where they'd disappeared to. They'd come into the factory to work, and the people in beach clothes had gone out to have fun.
and generate electricity. Suddenly, it all started to make sense. People who came to the sty thought they were going on holiday, but they were hypnotized as soon as they walked in, and after that they spent half their time working on machines and the other half sliding down ramps to make the power that ran the machines. And no one gave them any wages. They paid to be there. It was a wonderful scheme for making money. For a second, even though he was trussed up and on his way to Pitcairn Island, Lloyd had a moment of sheer delight. He'd done it. He'd found out the headmaster's plan. But then he remembered that the headmaster had never been interested in being rich. He didn't want money. He wanted to be in charge of things. How would this factory help him to do that? End of side 4.